The voices started 3 nights after the last body was carried out, and they came not from the living, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that shouldn't exist in the empty streets of the leather quarter. Isabella heard them first, standing at the boundary line where the healthy city ended and the forbidden zone began, a chalk mark on cobblestones that separated the world of the living from the realm of the abandoned. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The voices were not words exactly, more like the memory of conversation, the echo of life that had been lived in those narrow streets before the pestilence swept through like God's own broom. Isabella stood at the chalk line with her lantern held high, listening to sounds that made no sense, that violated every rule of the natural world. The quarter was empty. The city guard had verified it themselves, going door to door, removing the last of the dead, nailing shut the entrances, declaring the entire district cursed and forbidden. No one lived there any more. No one could be making those sounds. And yet they came, laughter faint and far away, the creak of a shop sign swinging in wind that wasn't blowing, footsteps on cobblestones where no feet walked, a child singing a counting rhyme in the darkness, the words clear enough to understand, but impossible to locate. Isabella was 17 years old, an apprentice physician's assistant, and she had been trained to trust evidence and observation over superstition. But the evidence before her now contradicted everything rational, everything explicable. "You hear it, too," said a voice behind her, and Isabella spun to find Marco standing there, a young city guardsman barely older than herself. His face was pale in the moonlight, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword as if steel could defend against whatever created those sounds. "I've been posted here every night since the quarter was sealed. The voices start at sunset and continue until dawn. Sometimes they're loud enough I can almost understand the words. Sometimes they fade to nothing. But they're always there." Isabella had grown up in the city of Castelmare, a prosperous trading port on the Adriatic coast, where her father had been a physician of some renown before the plague took him. She had learned her letters, studied the classical texts, absorbed the wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates alongside the more practical knowledge of setting bones and mixing tinctures. She believed in humors and miasmas, and the power of bloodletting and the efficacy of prayer, but she did not believe in ghosts. The dead were dead, their souls departed to judgment, their bodies rotting in the ground or burning in plague pits. They did not walk the streets making conversation. "It's the wind," Isabella said, though she did not believe it herself. "Or rats. The quarter is full of rats now, feeding on what was left behind. They make all manner of sounds." "Listen," Marco said, holding up a hand for silence. And Isabella listened, really listened this time, letting her rational defenses drop just enough to hear what was actually there. Not wind, not rats, but voices, definitely voices coming from somewhere deep in the leather quarter. A woman's laugh, bright and genuine. A man's voice raised in what might have been argument or might have been jest. The clatter of dishes being laid out for a meal. The bark of a dog that couldn't possibly still be alive, that must have starved weeks ago or fled into the countryside. And beneath it all, a kind of ambient hum, the sound of a neighborhood alive with human activity, with all the small noises that people make when they live together in close quarters. "It's not possible," Isabella said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "No," Marco agreed, "it's not. And yet here we are, listening to it. The question is, what do we do about it?" What they did, initially, was nothing. The city council had declared the leather quarter off-limits, had placed guards at every entry point with orders to let no one pass. The entire district was to be left sealed for a full year, maybe longer, to ensure that any trace of contagion had died out completely. It was the same policy that had been applied to other plague-struck neighborhoods, and it had worked well enough. Leave the dead to their silence. Let the buildings stand empty until nature reclaimed them, and eventually the city would expand in other directions, leaving the cursed ground to grass and weeds and forgetfulness. But the leather quarter was different from those other places. It had been the heart of the city's leather trade, home to tanners and cobblers and harness makers, to workshops that had supplied goods throughout the region. More than that, it had been a real community, tight-knit and proud, with its own customs and festivals and ways of doing things. 500 people had lived there before the plague. Now all 500 were gone, dead or fled, and the city fathers had no interest in reclaiming the space. Too much death had occurred there. Too much grief was embedded in those stones. Isabella should have left it alone. She had no authority to investigate, no official standing beyond her role as assistant to Physician Thomas. And he was old now, cautious, unwilling to take risks or challenge the council's decrees. But the voices troubled her in a way she couldn't articulate, not because she believed in ghosts, but because she needed to understand. Her entire training had been about observation and logic, about finding rational explanations for phenomena that seemed mysterious. She couldn't just walk away from a puzzle this profound. So she went back the next night and the night after that, each time standing at the chalk boundary and listening to the impossible sounds emanating from the abandoned quarter. Marco was always there, keeping his watch, and gradually they began to talk in the quiet hours between sunset and dawn. She learned he had been a guardsman for 3 years, that he had lost his entire family to the plague, that he requested the posting at the leather quarter specifically because the isolation suited his grief. He learned she was determined to become a physician herself, despite the guild's reluctance to accept women, that she believed in reason above all else, that the mystery of the voices was eating at her more surely than any disease. "You want to go in?" Marco said on the 4th night. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "You want to cross the line and see what's actually there?" "Yes," Isabella admitted. "Though I know it's forbidden. Though I know it's probably dangerous. But how can we understand what's happening if we don't investigate?" "We could be wrong about the quarter being empty," Marco said slowly, thinking through possibilities. "Maybe someone survived, someone sick enough that the guards missed them when they did their sweep. Maybe they've recovered, and what we're hearing is them trying to live normally, pretending the world hasn't ended around them." It was a rational explanation, the kind Isabella wanted to believe, but it didn't quite fit. The sounds were too varied, too numerous. Not one survivor, but many. Not the sounds of someone trying to live quietly, but of a whole community going about its business. If there were truly that many people still in the quarter, someone would have seen them. Some sign would have emerged beyond these mysterious nighttime voices. Or, Marco continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, the dead are not as dead as we think. Maybe the plague did something to them, changed them in some way we don't understand. Maybe what we're hearing is something that shouldn't exist, something unnatural that was created by the disease. Isabella wanted to dismiss this as superstition, as the kind of peasant fear that her education had taught her to reject. But she had seen things during the plague months that defied easy explanation. She had watched patients waste away in days when they should have taken weeks to die. She had seen fever create visions so vivid the sufferers could describe people and places they had never known. She had observed the way the disease moved through communities, skipping some households entirely while devastating others, following no pattern of humors or miasmas that the old text described. What if the plague had done more than just kill? What if it had left something behind, some residue or echo or transformation that persisted in places where death had been concentrated? It was not a scientific hypothesis, not something she could test or measure. But standing there at the boundary, listening to those impossible voices, she found she could not entirely dismiss it either. "If I go in," Isabella said carefully, "if I cross the line and investigate, will you come with me?" Marco looked at her for a long moment, weighing duty against curiosity, fear against the human need to understand. Finally, he nodded. "Yes," he said, "but not until we've prepared properly. If there's contagion still active in there, we need protection. And if there's something else, something unnatural, we need to be ready for that too." They spent the next 3 days gathering supplies and making plans. Isabella raided Physician Tomas's stores for protective equipment, taking waxed cloth masks soaked in vinegar, leather gloves, heavy robes that could be burned afterward. She packed her medical bag with the usual supplies, bandages, and herbs, and a small surgical kit along with things she hoped she wouldn't need. Holy water borrowed from the cathedral, a small vial of consecrated oil prayers, written on parchment that a priest had assured her would ward against evil spirits. Marco contributed his own preparations. He sharpened his sword and borrowed a second one for Isabella, though she had never held such a weapon before. He brought rope and a grappling hook in case they needed to enter buildings from above. He obtained torches treated with pine resin that would burn bright and long, pushing back the darkness that surely filled the abandoned quarter. And he made a map tracing out the streets and alleys of the leather quarter from memory, marking the locations of wells and shops and the major workshops that had once been the district as pride. "We go in at dusk," Marco said as they reviewed their preparations on the third evening. "That's when the voices start. We follow them to their source, observe whatever can be observed, and we leave before dawn. We take no unnecessary risks. If we encounter actual people, we offer them help. If we encounter anything else—" He trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence. "If we encounter anything else, we document it and leave," Isabella said firmly. "We're investigators, not heroes. Our job is to understand, not to fight." They crossed the chalk boundary just as the sun touched the horizon, stepping from the world of the living into the realm of the abandoned. The transition was immediate and unsettling. The air felt different on the other side, heavier somehow, thick with a smell that was part rot, and part something else, something Isabella's nose couldn't quite identify. The buildings loomed above them, their windows dark and empty, their doors hanging open or nailed shut, depending on what the guard had found inside. The cobblestones were littered with debris, clothing, and tools, and household goods that had been left behind in the desperate flight of the dying. And everywhere was silence. Not the peaceful quiet of evening, but an oppressive absence of sound that pressed against Isabella A's ears. like cotton. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through eaves or water dripping from gutters. Just silence, absolute and complete, so profound that her own breathing seemed obscenely loud. The voices, Isabella whispered. Where are they? Wait, Marco said, his hand on her arm. Listen. She listened, and then gradually she began to hear it. Not the voices themselves, but something underneath the silence, a kind of anticipation, as if the quarter was holding its breath, waiting for something. The sun slipped below the horizon. Darkness rushed in like water filling a basin, and as the last light faded from the sky, the voices began. They started softly, just a murmur at first, like conversation heard through thick walls. But they grew quickly, swelling and multiplying until the entire quarter seemed alive with sound. Isabella heard a woman singing as she worked, her voice bright and clear in the darkness. She heard men arguing over the price of leather, their voices raised in good-natured dispute. She heard children playing some game in an alley, their laughter high and genuine. She heard 100 small sounds of ordinary life doors opening and closing, footsteps on stairs, the clatter of pots and pans, the bark of dogs, and the squawk of chickens. It was impossible, completely, utterly impossible. And yet it surrounded them, engulfed them, made them feel like interlopers in a world that was somehow still alive despite the evidence of their eyes. This way, Marco said, pointing down a street to their right. The sounds are loudest in that direction. They walked through the abandoned quarter, following the voices deeper into the maze of narrow streets and tight alleys. Isabella's torch cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the empty buildings seem to shift and move. They passed shops that had once sold goods to the entire city, the cobbler, as where Isabella's father had bought his shoes, the harness makers that had supplied the city guard, the tannery that had employed 50 men, and filled the air with the distinctive smell of curing leather. All empty now, all silent and dark, and yet the voices continued, seeming to come from these very buildings, from the workshops and homes they passed. Isabella would hear conversation coming from a doorway, would turn to look inside, and see only darkness and emptiness. She would hear footsteps approaching from behind, would spin with her heart racing, and find no one there. The sounds were real enough, she was certain of that, but they had no physical source, no bodies to produce them. It's like we're hearing the past, Isabella said, voicing the thought that had been forming in her mind. Not ghosts, exactly, but memories, echoes of life that was lived here. But why? Marco asked. Why here? Why now? Other places suffered the plague. Other districts were emptied. But only the leather quarter has voices. It was a good question, one Isabella had no answer for. They continued deeper into the quarter, following the sounds, and gradually Isabella began to notice patterns. The voices were not random or chaotic. They followed rhythms, repeated phrases and sounds at regular intervals. The woman singing her work song, Isabella, heard her 3 times in the space of an hour, always the same song, always at the same point in the melody. The children playing their game, she heard them twice, and both times the game ended with the same triumphant shout from the same child's voice. It's like a performance, Isabella said, or a dream that keeps repeating, the same moments over and over. They turned a corner into a small square that had once been the heart of the leather quarter as social life. A well stood at its center, and around it were the shelves of buildings that had housed the district's most prosperous merchants. Isabella remembered this square from before the plague. remembered it filled with people during market days, with stalls and vendors, and the pleasant chaos of commerce. Now it was empty, the well dry, the buildings dark and silent. But the voices here were louder, more concentrated. Isabella could hear dozens of conversations happening simultaneously, could pick out individual words and phrases. A woman haggling over the price of boots, a man discussing the quality of a leather saddle, children begging for honey cakes from a vendor who no longer existed. And underneath it all, that strange ambient hum of human activity, of life being lived in all its ordinary, extraordinary variety. There, Marco said, pointing to the largest building on the square, a 3-story structure that had been the guild hall for the leather workers. That's where the sounds are strongest. They approached the building cautiously, Isabella's torch held high, Marco's hand on his sword. The guild hall's door hung open, revealing darkness beyond. The sounds were definitely coming from inside conversation and laughter and the scrape of chairs on wooden floors. It sounded like a feast was happening, like the hall was full of people celebrating some occasion. Isabella stepped through the doorway and stopped, her breath catching. The hall was exactly as empty as it should be. No people, no furniture, no sign that anyone had been here in months. The floor was covered in dust and debris. The windows were broken. Birds had nested in the rafters, their droppings white against the old wood. It was a dead space, abandoned and decaying. But the sounds continued. All around her, Isabella could hear people talking and laughing, could hear the clink of cups and the scrape of plates. She could hear music playing, a lute and a drum, keeping time for voices raised in song. She could hear all of this as clearly as if she stood in the midst of a living celebration, and yet she saw nothing, no one, no explanation for what her ears insisted was real. "This is impossible," she whispered, and her voice seemed to cut through the other sounds, to create a sudden pocket of silence in the midst of the phantom celebration. The voices faltered, stopped, and for a moment the hall was truly quiet. Then slowly, tentatively, they started again, building back to their previous volume, as if whatever created them had been briefly surprised by the intrusion of a living voice, but was now resuming its work. Marco stood beside her, his face illuminated by the torchlight, and Isabella saw her own confusion and fear reflected there. "What do we do?" he asked. "We investigate," Isabella said, forcing herself to sound more confident than she felt. "We document what we're experiencing. We look for a rational explanation." They spent the next hour exploring the guild hall, examining every corner and surface for clues. Isabella took notes in a small journal she'd brought, describing the sounds in detail, noting their patterns and variations. Marco searched for signs of recent habitation food, bedding, anything that might indicate survivors hiding in the quarter. They found nothing. The hall was as empty as it appeared, as dead as it should be, and yet the celebration continued around them, invisible and inexplicable. As they prepared to leave, to retreat across the chalk line, and consider what they had learned, Isabella noticed something she had missed before. On one wall of the guild hall, someone had written words in charcoal, the letters large and crude. "We are still here." The writing was recent. The charcoal still left marks on Isabella's glove when she touched it. Someone had been in this building since the quarter was sealed. Someone had left a message. But whether that someone was among the living or the dead, Isabella could not say. They returned the next night and the night after that, each time penetrating deeper into the mystery of the leather quarter. Isabella mapped the sounds, noting where they were strongest and where they faded. She discovered that the voices followed the rhythms of a normal day louder during what would have been working hours, quieter late at night, resuming at dawn. She found more messages written on walls, all in the same crude charcoal hand. Listen and you will hear U.S. The plague did not take everything. We remain. Marco interviewed the guards who had conducted the initial sweep of the quarter, asking them to describe exactly what they had found and how they had conducted their search. The story was consistent. They had gone door to door, had found only corpses and emptiness, had sealed the district and walked away. No survivors, no signs of life, just death and decay. And yet someone was writing messages on walls. Someone or something was creating the voices, and Isabella was determined to understand what and why. On the 5th night, they made a breakthrough. Isabella had been studying the patterns of the voices, noting which sounds repeated and which varied, and she realized that the repetitions were not exact. The woman singing her work song each time Isabella heard it, the song was slightly different, as if the singer was improvising or remembering new verses. The children playing their game, they played longer each night, added new elements, argued in ways they hadn't before. They're not recordings, Isabella said, excitement breaking through her fear. They're not just echoes playing back. They're growing, changing, learning. That's impossible, Marco said, but his voice lacked conviction. They had seen too much impossibility to dismiss anything anymore. What if, Isabella said slowly, working through the hypothesis as she spoke, what if the plague didn't just kill people? What if it did something else, too? What if it captured them somehow, preserved them in some form we don't understand? Not as bodies, but as, I don't know, as patterns, as memories that somehow continue to exist and act and grow. It was not science. It was barely even speculation, but it fit the evidence better than anything else Isabella had conceived. The voices were too complex to be mere echoes, too reactive to be simple hauntings. They behaved like people, like a community, like something that was aware and active, even if it wasn't physical in any conventional sense. If that's true, Marco said, then what do we do about it? How do we help them? Can we help them? Isabella had no answer. She stood in the center of the abandoned quarter, surrounded by the voices of the dead or the changed or whatever they were, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. If these were truly people in some form, if they were aware and suffering or simply existing in this strange half-state, then didn't she have an obligation to do something? But what? How did you help someone who had no body, no physical presence, no way to interact with the material world? They continued their investigations, night after night, week after week. Isabella documented everything, filled journals with observations and hypotheses and questions that had no answers. She spoke to priests and scholars, described what she was experiencing in careful, rational terms, and watched them back away in fear or dismiss her as delusional. No one wanted to believe that the plague had done more than simply kill. No one wanted to acknowledge the possibility that death might not be the final ending, that something could persist in a form that violated all natural law. Marco remained her only ally, the only person who had witnessed what she had witnessed and could corroborate her claims. Together they became obsessed with the mystery, spending every night in the quarter, learning its rhythms and patterns, beginning to distinguish individual voices from the general chaos of sound. There was the woman who sang work songs. Isabella began to think of her as Anna, after a leather worker's wife she had known before the plague. There was a man who argued constantly about the price and quality of goods. She called him Carlo, giving him the name of the merchant who had occupied the largest shop on the square. There were the children, always playing, always laughing, and Isabella gave them names too. Pietro and Julia and small Marco, who had the highest voice and the most infectious laugh. It was irrational to name them, to treat them as if they were truly individuals rather than phantoms or echoes. But Isabella found she couldn't help it. The more she listened, the more she became convinced that these were people in some sense, that they maintained identity and personality and continuity, even in their impossible state. And then, on the 23rd night of investigation, Isabella heard her name. She was standing in the square, taking notes by torchlight, when a voice cut through the general cacophony. Not loud, not particularly distinct, but absolutely clear and unmistakable. Isabella. She froze, her pencil hovering over the page. Marco looked at her sharply. "What is it? Did you hear that?" Isabella whispered. "Someone said my name." Marco shook his head. "I heard the usual sounds. Conversation. Laughter. Nothing specific." Isabella set down her journal and closed her eyes, listening with total concentration. The voices continued their usual patterns, the work song, the children's game, the endless haggling over prices. But underneath all of that she heard it again. "Isabella, we see you. We know you're here." It was a woman's voice, calm and gentle. Not threatening, but somehow profoundly sad. Isabella opened her eyes and turned slowly, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the very air around her. "Who are you?" Isabella said aloud, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. "What are you?" The other voices faded, dropping to a murmur, as if whatever created them had decided to focus on this one conversation. The woman's voice came again, clearer now. "We are what remains. We are the ones who could not leave. We are trapped between dying and death, held here by something we don't understand." Isabella's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was not an echo or a memory. This was communication, real and interactive and impossible. "How many of you are there?" she asked. "All of us," the voice said. "All who died here. We remain, Isabella. We remain, and we suffer, not in pain, but in confusion. We don't understand what we are. We don't understand why we persist." Marco had gone pale, his hand tight on his sword hilt, though he had nothing to fight. Isabella forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, despite the impossibility of what was happening. "The plague," Isabella said. "Did the plague do this to you?" "The plague killed us," the voice said, "but something else kept us. Something in this place, in the ground, or the air, or the stones themselves. We died, but we couldn't move on. We tried so hard. But something holds us here, makes us repeat and remember, makes us continue when we should have ended." Isabella thought about the leather quarter, about its unique character and history. This had been the city's tanning district for 300 years, a place where animal skins were treated with harsh chemicals, where lime and urine and tannic acid had soaked into the very stones. What if something in that concentration of chemicals had interacted with the plague in some unexpected way? What if it had created conditions that allowed consciousness to persist after death, to be trapped in a state between life and ending? It was fantastical, unscientific, impossible, to prove, but it was also the closest thing to a rational explanation that Isabella had found. "Can we help you?" "Isabella," asked the voice, "can we free you?" There was a long silence. When the voice came again, it was even sadder than before. "We don't know. We've been trying to reach out, to make contact, but until you came, no one would listen. Everyone else runs away or denies what they hear. You're the first to stay, to investigate, to believe. Tell me what you need," Isabella said. "Tell me what we can do." The voice seemed to consider this. The other sounds of the quarter had gone completely silent now, as if everyone was listening to this conversation, waiting to hear what would be said. "We need to be remembered," the voice said finally. "We need someone to know what happened to us, to understand that we didn't just die and disappear. We were people, Isabella. We had lives and families and hopes. We were the leather workers of Castelmare, and we were proud of our craft. Don't let us be forgotten. Don't let our district be abandoned and erased." Isabella felt tears on her cheeks, though she didn't remember starting to cry. "I won't," she said. "I promise. I'll tell your story. I'll make people understand, and maybe," the voice said, so softly Isabella almost couldn't hear it, "maybe if enough people remember, if enough people acknowledge what we were, we'll finally be able to let go. Maybe memory is the key we've been searching for." The presence faded then, withdrawing into the general chaos of sound that filled the quarter. Isabella stood in the square with tears streaming down her face, Marco beside her looking shocked and awed and frightened all at once. "Did that really happen?" Marco asked. "Did we really just have a conversation with the dead?" "I don't know what we had a conversation with," Isabella said, "but yes, it happened. And now we have to decide what to do about it." What they did was document everything, more thoroughly than ever before. Isabella wrote detailed descriptions of every voice she could distinguish, creating a record of the people who had lived in the Leather Quarter. She researched the history of the district, interviewed survivors who had fled before the plague struck, compiled names and stories and memories. She created, in effect, a monument in words to a community that had been lost. Marco helped by gathering physical evidence. He collected objects from the abandoned buildings, things that had belonged to the residents, a cobbler's tools, a child's toy, a leather-bound journal that had belonged to the guild master. They cataloged everything, created a kind of museum of memory dedicated to preserving what the Leather Quarter had been. And as they worked, the voices changed. They became more coherent, more focused. Isabella found she could have actual conversations with the presence she thought of as Anna, could ask questions and receive answers. Other voices began to emerge as individuals too. Carlo the merchant, who had opinions on everything. Pietro the child who missed his mother. Julia, who had been an apprentice leather worker and had died just days before completing her training. They were people, Isabella became convinced. Not living people, but not simple ghosts either. Something new, something created by the unique intersection of the plague and the chemical-saturated environment of the tanning district. They were consciousness without bodies, awareness without physical form, trapped in a state that shouldn't exist by any natural law. Isabella presented her findings to Physician Thomas, expecting skepticism or outright dismissal. Instead, the old man listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and finally nodded. "I have heard stories," Thomas said slowly, "from other places where the plague struck, places where the dying was especially concentrated, where conditions were unusual. There are reports of sounds, of presences, of phenomena that cannot be explained by conventional understanding. The Church dismisses these as superstition, and perhaps they are right. But perhaps there are mysteries in this world that our learning has not yet encompassed. What should I do? Isabella asked. How do I help them? You are already helping them, Thomas said. By listening, by remembering, by treating them as people rather than horrors. The dead, or whatever they are, want what the living want, to be acknowledged, to matter, to be remembered. Give them that, and perhaps they can finally rest. Isabella took this advice to heart. She organized a memorial service, working with the cathedral priests who were skeptical but willing to humor her. They held the service at the boundary of the leather quarter, gathering the few survivors who had escaped the plague, the families of those who had died. Isabella read names, all 500 of them, read from the records she had compiled. She told stories about the leather workers, about their craft and their pride, about the community they had built and sustained for generations. And as she spoke, as the names were read and the stories told, Isabella heard the voices of the quarter change. The constant repetition stopped. The work song fell silent. The children's game ended. For the first time since she had started investigating, the leather quarter went completely quiet, not with the oppressive silence of the empty place, but with the peaceful quiet of rest. They're listening, Marco whispered beside her. They can hear us. The memorial service lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it Isabella was exhausted and hoarse from reading. But she felt lighter too, as if she had fulfilled some essential obligation, had completed a task she hadn't known she was meant to perform. That night she and Marco returned to the quarter for what they both sensed would be the last time. The voices were different, now softer, more distant, as if they were fading or perhaps simply moving on. Isabella stood in the square and called out to the presence she knew as Anna. "Are you still here?" she asked. The response came faintly, as if from a great distance. "We are, but we are also leaving." "You gave us what we needed, Isabella. You remembered us. You told our stories. You made us matter. That was the key, not magic or ritual, but simple recognition. Simple acknowledgement that we existed and had value." "Where will you go?" Isabella asked. "We don't know," the voice said, and it sounded almost happy now, relieved. "But it doesn't matter. Anywhere is better than being trapped here, repeating our lives without end. Thank you, Isabella. Thank you for hearing us. Thank you for refusing to look away." The presence faded completely then, and with it the last of the voices. The leather quarter fell silent, truly silent, empty in a way it hadn't been since the plague struck. Isabella stood in the darkness with Marco beside her and felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Something profound had happened here, something that would change how she understood the world and death and the nature of consciousness itself. But it was over now. The voices were gone. The dead had finally died or moved on, or whatever happened when memory and acknowledgement allowed them to release their grip on the physical world. "What do we tell people?" Marco asked as they walked back to the chalk boundary. "How do we explain what happened here?" "We tell the truth," Isabella said. "Not the full truth that would sound like madness, but we tell them that the leather quarter was home to a great community, that 500 people lived and worked and died there, and that they deserve to be remembered. We create a proper memorial, something permanent. We make sure future generations know what was lost." "And the voices?" Marco asked. Do we mention those? Isabella thought about it for a long moment. We mention sounds, she said finally, strange echoes in abandoned places. We describe it in vague terms, leave room for interpretation. Some will believe we heard ghosts. Others will think it was wind and rats and imagination. But we'll know the truth, and that has to be enough. The city council agreed to Isabella's proposal for a memorial, though they remained skeptical about the details of her investigation. A stone monument was erected at the entrance to the leather quarter, inscribed with the names of all who had died there. The buildings were eventually torn down, and the land was converted to a park, a green space dedicated to the memory of the community that had been lost. Isabella completed her training with physician Thomas, and eventually took over his practice when he retired. She became known as an excellent doctor, rational and skilled, though she also developed a reputation for taking seriously reports of strange phenomena that others dismissed as superstition. She investigated several other sites where the plague had struck, looking for more instances of the impossible voices, but she never found anything as clear or as profound as what had happened in the leather quarter. Marco remained a city guardsman, but became one of Isabella's closest friends and confidants. They never spoke publicly about what they had experienced, but privately they continued to discuss it, to try to understand what had happened and what it meant. Years later, when Isabella was old and gray and well-respected in her field, a young medical student came to her with a question. He had been reading her journals, the ones she had kept during the plague years, and he had found references to phenomena she had observed but never fully explained. "These voices you mention," the student said, "the sounds in abandoned places, were they real, or were they products of stress and grief, hallucinations brought on by trauma?" Isabella looked at the young man, so earnest and eager, so confident in his rational understanding of the world. She thought about how to answer, how much truth he could handle. "They were real," she said finally, "as real as anything can be when we read talking about consciousness and memory and the persistence of awareness beyond death. But they were also not real in the way we usually mean that word. They existed in a space between what is and what was, between life and death, between matter and memory." "That's not a scientific answer," the student said, frowning. "No," Isabella agreed, "it's not. Because there are some phenomena that science, at least as we understand it now, cannot adequately explain. There are mysteries in this world that resist our categories and definitions. The voices were one of those mysteries. But you investigated them anyway," the student said. "You documented them, studied them, tried to understand them." "Of course," Isabella said, "that's what we do. We observe, we document, we try to make sense of things, even when they seem to make no sense. And sometimes we discover that the universe is stranger and more complex than our theories can accommodate. That doesn't mean we stop trying to understand. It means we expand our understanding to include new possibilities." The student left eventually, unsatisfied but thoughtful, and Isabella returned to her work. But that night, as she sat in her study reviewing patient notes, she thought about the leather quarter and the voices that had filled it. She thought about Anna and Carlo and little Pietro, about the community of the dead who had been trapped between states, who had found release through the simple act of being remembered. She wondered sometimes if they had truly moved on, or if they existed somewhere still, in some form she couldn't perceive. She wondered if consciousness really ended with death, or if it transformed into something else, something that could persist in the right conditions. She wondered if there were other places like the Leather Quarter, other communities of the displaced and the trapped, waiting for someone to hear them and acknowledge their existence. These were not questions she could answer, not with the tools and knowledge available to her, but they were questions worth asking, worth holding in her mind even when they had no resolution, because the alternative to pretend such mysteries didn't exist, to dismiss anything that didn't fit her understanding, seemed like a betrayal of what she had experienced, of the promise she had made to the voices in the darkness. Isabella lived to be 73 years old, respected and accomplished, known for her skill as a physician and her willingness to consider possibilities that others rejected. When she died peacefully in her sleep, her journals were preserved by her students and eventually made their way into the city's archives. Generations of scholars would puzzle over her plague journals, over the strange phenomena she described, over the voices that had filled the abandoned quarter for those few weeks after the pestilence passed. Most would conclude she had suffered some kind of breakdown, that trauma and grief had created hallucinations vivid enough to seem real. A few would wonder if perhaps she had stumbled onto something true, something about the nature of consciousness and death that their science couldn't yet measure or explain. But in the park that had been built on the site of the Leather Quarter, where children played and families gathered, where the memorial stone stood with its 500 names carved in marble, people sometimes reported hearing things, whispers on the wind, laughter that had no source, the faint sound of singing from nowhere in particular. Most dismissed these reports as imagination or tricks of the air, but a few would stop and listen, really listen, and in those moments they would feel connected to something larger than themselves. They would sense the presence of all those who had come before, all those who had lived and worked and died in this place. They would feel, just for a moment, the weight of memory and the persistence of life in forms that transcended the physical. And in those moments the promise Isabella had made would be fulfilled again. The dead would be remembered. Their stories would persist. And perhaps, in being remembered, they would find whatever peace there was to find. The Leather Quarter remained a green space, a park and memorial, for centuries. The city grew around it, buildings rising higher and streets spreading wider, but that one plot of land remained dedicated to memory and rest. The memorial stone weathered and aged, but was regularly cleaned and maintained by the city. The names remained legible. 500 souls who had perished in the plague, preserved in stone and in the city's collective memory. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the park was empty and the light was fading, people walking by would hear sounds. Not frightening sounds, but comforting ones. The sound of community, of people living together, of ordinary life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. They would hear and wonder, and then they would walk on, carrying with them a sense that death was not the end of all things, that something could persist, that memory itself might be a force more powerful than any plague. Isabella's story passed into legend, told and retold, changing with each generation. Some versions made her a hero who had battled demons. Others made her a scientist who had discovered fundamental truths about the nature of consciousness. A few treated her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of investigating things best left alone. But in every version, certain elements remained constant. The voices in the abandoned quarter, the young woman who refused to look away, the community of the dead who needed only to be remembered, and the fundamental truth that ran through all the variations, that acknowledgement matters, that memory has power, that the dead do not truly die so long as someone remembers they lived. In time, even these legends faded, worn away by the centuries like the features on an old coin. The park remained, the memorial stood, but fewer and fewer people knew the full story of what had happened there. The Leather Quarter became just another place, just another piece of history, its mysteries forgotten or transformed into vague folklore about ghosts and hauntings. But the truth remained, buried in archives and journals, waiting for someone curious enough to uncover it, waiting for another person like Isabella, someone willing to listen to impossible sounds and believe in things that violated rational understanding, someone willing to stand at the boundary between the known and the unknowable and choose investigation over fear, because the universe was full of such boundaries, such mysteries, such places where the rules bent or broke entirely. The plague had revealed one such place, had created conditions where consciousness could persist beyond death, where memory could take on physical form. But there were others. Isabella had been certain of that. Other phenomena waiting to be discovered and documented and understood. And somewhere, in some form that transcended physical limitation, the voices of the Leather Quarter continued. Not trapped any more, not suffering, but existing in some state that Isabella's investigation had helped them reach. They existed as memory and story, as inspiration for future investigators, as proof that the world was stranger and more wonderful than any simple theory could encompass. They existed, and they whispered still to those who would listen. We were here. We lived. We mattered. Remember us. And in the remembering, they found their immortality, their peace, their final release from the trap that had held them. They found what all the dead seek, what all the living will someday need, the simple acknowledgement that they existed, that they had value, that their brief time in the world meant something. Isabella had given them that gift, and in giving it, she had discovered something profound about the nature of death and memory and the human need to be witnessed. She had learned that the boundaries between life and death were more permeable than anyone suspected, that consciousness could take forms that science didn't yet have names for, that love and attention and simple acknowledgement were forces more powerful than any plague. These truths lived on in her journals, in the memorial stone, in the whispered legends about the voices in the abandoned quarter. They lived on in every person who stopped to listen to the wind and heard, just for a moment, the echo of lives that had been lived and lost and somehow impossibly preserved. The voices continued, would always continue, so long as someone remembered to listen, so long as someone stood at the boundary and chose understanding over fear, so long as memory persisted and stories were told and the dead were honored, not with silence, but with sound, with the acknowledgement of their existence, with the simple truth that they were here, they lived, they mattered. And in that acknowledgement, in that remembering, in that refusal to let the dead be forgotten, there was a kind of magic more powerful than any the world had known. The magic of attention, the magic of witness, the magic of love that persists beyond the grave, that transforms the dead from forgotten casualties into people who are honored and cherished, and kept alive in the hearts and minds of those who come after. Isabella had understood this, had lived it, had made it her life's work to remember and to help others remember. And in doing so, she had given not just the dead of the Leather Quarter, but all the dead a gift beyond price, the promise that they would not be forgotten, that their lives would echo forward through time, that they would remain in memory and story and the whispered legends that people told when walking through parks at twilight. The voices remained, would always remain, waiting for the next person brave enough to listen, curious enough to investigate, compassionate enough to remember, waiting to tell their stories again, to share their truth, to remind the living that death is not the end of all things, that something persists, that the boundary between what is and what was is thinner than anyone imagines. And in that waiting, in that persistence, in that eternal readiness to be heard and acknowledged and remembered, the voices of the Leather Quarter fulfilled their purpose. They became not a horror or a mystery, but a gift, a reminder that every life matters, that every person deserves to be remembered, that the human need to be witnessed, and valued extends beyond the grave and into whatever strange territories lie beyond our understanding. Isabella had heard that truth in the darkness of the abandoned quarter. She had documented it, studied it, shared it with all who would listen. And in the end, she had joined the voices herself, her own consciousness, passing into whatever strange realm awaited beyond death, secure in the knowledge that she would be remembered, that her work would continue, that she had made a difference in the lives of both the living and the dead. The park remained, the memorial stood, the voices whispered on, and the city of Castelmare grew and changed and forgot and remembered, as all cities do, as all human communities must. But in the green space where the Leather Quarter had been, where 500 souls had perished and somehow persisted, there remained always a sense of presence, of attention, of awareness that transcended ordinary understanding. And those who were sensitive enough to feel it, who were willing to listen with more than their ears, would sense the truth, that the dead are not gone, not entirely, not so long as someone remembers, that memory is a force more powerful than death, that the voices of the past continue, waiting to be heard, waiting to tell their stories, waiting for someone brave enough and compassionate enough and curious enough to listen. That was Isabella's gift to the world. That was the truth she uncovered in the abandoned quarter. And that truth lived on, passed from generation to generation, sometimes forgotten, but never entirely lost, always waiting to be rediscovered by those who needed to hear it. The voices continued, would always continue, speaking from the boundary between life and death, between matter and memory, between the known and the mysterious, speaking of all they had been, all they had lost, all they hoped to remain in the hearts and minds of those who came after. Listen, they whispered. Remember, we were here. We mattered. We live still in your memory, in your stories, in the attention you pay to our existence. We live because you remember. And in remembering, you give us the only immortality that matters, the immortality of love, of witness, of acknowledgement that we existed and had value and deserved to be honored. The whispers continued, soft and persistent, carrying forward through time like ripples spreading across still water. The Leather Quarter was gone, its buildings demolished, its streets erased, but its voice remained, speaking through the memorial stone, through Isabella's journals, through the legends that were told, and the moments of strange sound that people reported in the park. It remained because someone had listened, because someone had cared enough to investigate, to document, to remember, because Isabella had refused to accept the easy explanation, had chosen to believe in the impossible, had stood at the boundary between worlds and chosen understanding over fear. That choice echoed forward, inspiring others to listen in their own ways, to pay attention to the voices that surrounded them, the voices of the past, the voices of the forgotten, the voices of those who existed in forms that defied easy categorization. Those voices were everywhere, Isabella had discovered, not just in abandoned quarters, but in old buildings and lonely places, in the quiet moments when the world seemed to speak with more than one voice. And the more people listened, the more they heard. The more they acknowledged, the more was revealed. The world was full of mysteries, full of phenomena that didn't fit into comfortable categories, full of evidence that death was not the simple ending that everyone assumed. Isabella had cracked that door open. She had shown that investigation and compassion and simple willingness to listen could reveal truths that transformed understanding. She had proved that science didn't have to choose between reason and mystery, that it was possible to be rational and still acknowledge that the universe contained wonders that current knowledge couldn't explain. Her legacy lived on in every person who chose curiosity over fear, who investigated strange phenomena instead of dismissing them, who treated reports of the impossible with respect instead of scorn. It lived on in the park that had been the Leather Quarter, in the memorial that honored 500 lives, in the whispered stories about voices that refused to be silenced. And it lived on in the voices themselves, however they existed, wherever they existed. They continued their patient vigil, waiting for the next listener, the next investigator, the next person who would hear them and acknowledge their existence and give them the gift of memory that allowed them to finally, fully rest. That was the truth Isabella had discovered in the abandoned quarter. That was the gift she had given to the dead and to the living alike. And that gift continued, passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation, from one listener to the next, an eternal promise that no one would be forgotten, that every voice deserved to be heard, that death itself could not silence those who had something to say, and someone willing to listen. The voices whispered on, soft and patient and eternal, speaking their truth into the darkness, waiting for ears that could hear, for hearts that could understand, for minds that could accept the impossible possibility that the dead do not die. Not entirely, not so long as memory remains and stories are told, and someone somewhere continues to listen. And in that listening, in that remembering, in that refusal to let the dead be truly dead, there was a kind of magic that transcended any natural law. The magic of attention, the magic of love, the magic of the human spirit that insists on meaning and connection and continuity, even in the face of death itself. Isabella had found that magic in the abandoned quarter. She had documented it, studied it, shared it with all who would hear, and in doing so she had ensured that the voices would never be truly silent, that the dead would never be truly forgotten, that memory itself would become a bridge between worlds connecting the living and the dead in a communion that death itself could not break. The voices remained, speaking softly in the twilight, telling their stories to those who would listen, offering proof that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than any simple theory could capture. They remained as memory and presence, as whisper and echo, as evidence of mysteries that persisted beyond understanding. And they would remain forever, so long as someone remembered to listen, so long as someone stood at the boundary and chose investigation over fear, so long as the promise was kept that the dead would be honored, remembered, and allowed at last to rest in the peace that comes from being witnessed, acknowledged, and loved. That was the gift. That was the truth. That was the legacy of the voices in the abandoned quarter, speaking still through the centuries, waiting patiently for the next person brave enough to hear them and wise enough to understand. We were here. We mattered. Remember us. And in remembering, set us free.